Fine. Well, I'll try and do it fairly briefly. This is rather a different perspective from what you've just heard, because it's very much a historical talk about intercultural diplomacy, how it began, and the way in which it's changed, but looking at it purely from a Jewish point of view. But I'll introduce the general point of view first. So, first, just make a difference between what we call acculturation and assimilation. And basically, cultural diplomacy is culture is a very broad term, but in relation to a minority, it includes many things. It includes its religion, its language, its literature, its traditions and customs. So it's quite a wide perspective. Now, acculturation is when the minority starts to adapt to the majority, even though retaining its own identity and often its own religious practice. And that would apply in the Jewish experiences, that acculturation is virtually universal. The Jews, however stringent in their observance, have all acquired the culture of the surrounding society, but maintained some of its own. Now, where did this all begin? It's Germany, and what we call the Enlightenment. In European history, we refer to the period that started probably towards the end of the 17th century, achieved its climax in the 18th century as the age of the Enlightenment. This is the consequence of the scientific revolution. People begin to think in more secular, non-religious terms. In France, it's known as Lumière. In Germany, die Aufklärung. In Hebrew, the Haskalah. And these minorities are now being brought in to the general culture. And you see among the Jews the abandonment of many specific Jewish things, of Yiddish, for instance, which was the language of the Jews. We see among the German Jews, they start to speak German. Always an indication of the adoption of a language is a translation of the Bible into that language, so translating the Bible into German, so the Jews would learn to read the sacred text in the vernacular. Same as the development of English is very much related to the creation of the Bible. People like Tyndale and the Authorized Version, and Dutch as well. We see this with the Jewish experience. The Jews begin to see themselves in Germany, but not just in Germany, but Germany's most prominent example of Germans of Mosaic persuasion. So they're Jews by religion, but not by culture. Then you see a certain reaction to this, which occurs later on with people like Hirsch. Ostjuden is the very important term here, because it's a German term for people, from the Jews from the East, who were the ones basically they were reacting against. Now, what we have, and it's most prominent in Germany, but you see this throughout the European experience, and very much here in the United Kingdom and United States, among sort of the Anglo-Saxon cultures, is a sense of cultural superiority for Europe. So you're engaging in cultural dialogue, but always from a question that basically Europe is a superior one, the others are a bit primitive. And it draws on traditional rejection of the Jews in German culture. And you have I've referred to Heinrich von Treitschke, a very great German historian. And he goes further, because he's not actually a racial anti-Semite, but he's saying that Jews are not just a problem, but they are the problem. And he coined the phrase, Die Juden sind unser Unglück, the Jews are our misfortune, really saying that the actual things that are the misfortune of the country attributable to that minority, which is a saying which is picked up by the Nazis and becomes their motto, as it were. But the cultural anti-Semitism you see manifest throughout Germany, and the most interesting example is Wagner, who wrote an actual essay about Jews in music, and he criticized two of his contemporary Jews, one of whom was very, very fashionable and did help him, Meyerbeer, another one whose fame has endured, Mendelssohn. And he wanted to say that there was something inherently alien and inferior about the Jewish spirit, as it were, in culture. So you have very much looking down on it. And the irony, I've mentioned the name Hermann Levy, because some of the best exponents of Wagner were themselves Jews. And Wagner himself acknowledged this. So you have this sort of ambivalent attitude to Jews, sort of a contempt, but at the same time an appreciation from ones they met. And this metamorphosed later on into the idea that there was something derivative about the Jewish contribution. Jews could be very good instrumentalists, obviously the very famous Jewish violinists, pianists, etc., but wouldn't be capable of creating anything original of their own, like composition, which is an idea which has endured throughout the 20th century, and that's why I've just listed there, you see the names of a small number of Jewish composers, but in fact there's a far larger number if you actually just go into the subject. And this creates a reaction in the other culture of that sense of inferiority, which what was known in Germany often as self-hate, Selbsthass. And that book that I've listed there was written in 1930, so it's before the Nazis came to power, but a general sense that there was a very sort of superior German model, an inferior Jewish model, and cultural dialogue took place in that context. This was also interesting theologically. You see the development of Bible studies, and Wellhausen is one of the greatest Bible critics and scholars of the centuries, but his premise was always that the Bible is a history of progression, basically Judaism going the wrong way to priestly route, and Christianity bringing a superior version of a superior sort of vision of the religious experience. And that you see a number of Jews who actually see their role as rejecting Judaism in a very Jewish way. It starts with the famous philosopher Spinoza, but you see this throughout the labor movements in Eastern Europe, people like Marx, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, who's a Polish Jewess who makes her way in Germany. And you see this often in different elements of science where Jews are involved, where they look at it very much from a rationalist and international point of view rather than the Jewish one. Now we move on to the Anglo-Saxon experience, which is similar but much more benign. A man called Zangwill wrote a play which appeared in America in 1908 to huge acclaim, known as The Melting Pot. And the idea was, and this would apply not just to Jews but to all the minorities, that you came to the local country, the new country you were there, and you assimilated into it. And the American idea was that all these Italians, Poles, Germans, blacks, people from Asia, etc., they all would come in and they would emerge as Americans, and that it was like a melting pot. And Jews were articulating it. And we see this with three institutions in the United Kingdom. The Jewish Free School, and this is the largest Jewish school in the UK, in fact, probably the largest in Europe. And now, today, it's one of the largest in the world. And its mission was very clear. We're bringing out Englishmen. They may be Jewish by religious persuasion, but they should be English. You had Jewish public schools that were very much modelled on the English variety, on the homegrown variety, and Jews were learning there how to be English, how to take their place in society. Similarly, the Jewish Lads Brigade. And this would influence the way in which Jewish rabbis would practice. They would dress up like Church of England vicars, and they would talk like them. And the idea was to make the minority very much more part of the majority. People would change their name to be more acceptable. And they sort of felt they were very privileged to come to this country. So this model of accommodation to minorities has often been called the country house model, where someone has a home in the country and his guests come along. I'm drawing on the chief rabbi's analogy. The guests come along and they're all expected to eat together to conform to the mores of the host. And this is the idea. The host sets the agenda. He sets what you eat and how you behave and where you eat and what you do. And it's a country house. And the guests come and are expected to comply. So that was the traditional model of cultural dialogue. Now, during the 20th century, we see a massive change, which is what is underlying everything that we're doing now, and is one of the most important factors of modern history. And it's the rise of multiculturalism. And we see a complete change in people's attitudes. And the causes are there are many causes, and they're not easy actually to quantify them all. The first one, of course, is the most outstanding one because it's the most dramatic event of the 20th century, the Second World War. And the Second World War, you see Europe descending to a level of barbarism which shakes European self-confidence. But it has another aspect, because the Second World War is the first sort of great national war, which is very much an ideological war as well. And the United Nations, which was formed during the Second World War, and what actually bound the British and the Americans and the British Commonwealth together, was a sense that they're fighting for freedom and for democracy. Now, it's very difficult to say that you're fighting for freedom and democracy in Europe, and you're denying it to people who are asking for it in India or in Africa. And of course, the way in which soldiers were divided by race, not just in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom. This obviously reflected very badly. So the notion that we had actually work to do following the Second World War were very, very powerful. And of course, in the years immediately following the Second World War, you see the end of imperialism. It takes a long time, but you see the first step occurs very, very quickly. The jewel in the crown of the British Commonwealth, it was the British Empire at the time, the actual nation which gave the sovereign the title of Emperor, India, became free and independent in 1947. Now this is on the cards before, but the Second World War makes that tide absolutely inescapable, that people felt that they had to give independence, they had to give a recognition. And with that you have a change in the narrative. So you have a recognition that imperialism is not the white man's burden, the benign sort of phenomenon that we've always seen it, but it's something much more complicated, and much more recognition has to be given to the other nations. Parallel to that, you have in the United States the civil rights movement. And you have this sort of incredible situation where you're fighting a war against racism, and that's how the Second World War came to be seen, particularly in its last years. And you have the American forces who are divided on lines of color. And divided in a very, very discriminatory way. Despite the legislation in the Constitution, black soldiers would be treated would be paid less, be treated in inferior terms to whites, and given less prominence. So the civil rights movement took quite a long time actually to get underway. But you see by the 60s a recognition that we've got to, that things would have to change. And you have the growth of black consciousness. Now this again is important for the whole intercultural dialogue, because it's not merely a legal matter, but it's the beginnings of self-respect, the term black as opposed to coloured or the N-word. So you see a great change there. But there's another process which is happening in Europe. It's happening in Europe most obviously, but it's happening in the rest of the developed world to a certain extent, and that's the growth in racial minorities. And that's a new phenomenon that we're seeing after the Second World War as a result of the greater facilitation of travel. You have a large number of economic migrants, and I put up that term Gastarbeiter because that was the German term, obviously, for large numbers of workers who came partly from Southern Europe, but most particularly from Turkey. And that term is guest workers. And there was not seen to be any need for the country house model for them, because they were Gastarbeiter, they were just guests. They were expected to come and to go. And they came in their millions. The number of Turks in Germany is estimated as upwards of 4 million. But at first they were seen as entirely separate. Central European countries have a much more restrictive, much more historic concept of citizenship that doesn't acquire as quickly as it does in Anglo-Saxon countries. So these were people who were definitely not part of the country house. They were like hotel guests, as it were, the hotel version. They came, they stayed in the country. Obviously, after a while, one would give them equal rights, but they wouldn't be, you weren't seeking any kind of synthesis here. They weren't seeking to accommodate them. These were just people who would remain outside. Well, the result of that, of course, is the creation of a multicultural society, which does not see its way to coherent identity. So let's just move on there to the specific Jewish elements, because it means that the Jews are reacting to these kind of conditions rather in the same way that the other minorities, but with a specific Jewish edge. First of all, the Holocaust is obviously going to colour the Jewish perception of European culture because of its unfortunate experience there. And there's a sort of reaction to it. And what one has to bear in mind in relation to the Holocaust and early persecutions is a huge humiliation, which people actually often don't come to terms with. That it's not just a question of killing a few million people. There is a great humiliation being imposed on them and on the minorities. They're made to feel that they're not, they're not human, but they're very much inferior as well. So when the Germans, for instance, invaded Russia, before they started actually slaughtering people, they would pass rules like saying that Jews were not entitled to use the pavements. They would have to walk on the roads. In parallel to, you have signs in the southern parts of the United States saying that blacks weren't allowed to use swimming pools or parks. So you'd have this also brought in Eastern Europe, actually humiliating people, making so it's not just a sort of question of a genocide. So the reaction to that is an assertion of national pride, which you've got on part of all minorities, but in the Jewish case, it's taking a particular form from the results of the Holocaust. You see Eastern European communities largely wiped out, but small numbers of them being transplanted to the United Kingdom and even more to the United States. And they're coping much more firmly with the problem of assimilation because they're being much more assertive about their own identity. And of course, on the other side, they're no longer encountering a monolithic culture. They're seeing a culture which is itself diverse. Because once you have the recognition in the 1960s in Britain that you're having much larger racial minorities and they're here to stay. You have that recognition in the States that, you know, the civil rights legislation which was enacted, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, had much further to go. You need to do that. And the Black is Beautiful movement. Then Jews are saying, well, you know, there's no need for them to be conforming to a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, the WASP culture, when everybody else is accepting that it is just one of many, that the melting pot metaphor no longer applies. In the case of the Jews as well, you have the additional factor of the birth of the State of Israel, so that you have a place where Jews are now a majority and where a specifically Jewish culture is obviously going to be created because that is a national state. So it's a state which, although it has national minorities, over 20% of the citizens of the State of Israel are not Jewish, but the other 78, 79% are, and they're creating a new sort of Jewish culture in Israel. So that's, again, affecting the attitude of Jewish communities abroad. And you have, as a result, the end of opposition to Zionism from the mainstream Jewish community, from the progressive Jewish movements. Obviously, many people querying Zionism on political grounds, on its interaction with the Arab populations, but not on religious grounds anymore. Oops. So as a result, we have, hopefully, and this is not just a Jewish thing, but I've obviously pointed out the Jewish elements of this, a new synthesis. So we've moved beyond the country house model, beyond the idea that the host country is imposing its culture and imposing its ideas, its way of thinking and its literature on the minorities, but not moving to a sort of base multiculturalism with no real interaction, but a synthesis, a sort of modern culture which sees all these minorities as having something to contribute to the mainstream. So we see this obviously in this country with the growth of, you know, the large Asian populations and the diversity of them, you know, with the Muslim, the Hindu populations from the subcontinent and their contribution to British culture and British cuisine, the novels that are being produced by that community, our great appreciation of the music, and we see this with the Afro-Caribbean community in this country with things like, you know, the Notting Hill Carnival, and people talking about the experience of being an Afro-Caribbean in the UK, etc. Well, in the Jewish example, we've got the Jewish novel. And I mentioned the first two novelists, Bellow and Singer, because they both are Nobel laureates, which is a sign of recognition from the host culture of the contribution which they make. But other novelists, specifically in the United States. In the UK, you see contributions in drama, but these people often regarded as working not just as, you know, they're not just Jewish, but working from a specifically Jewish point of view. And you see this also in places like Hollywood. The Israeli contribution, of course, is now manifest and starts to be quite different from the Jewish, because the Israeli experience is an experience of a Jew in a state which claims to be the national state for Jews, and that's part of its identity. So their attitude is going to be much more emphatic as a majority, which of course a Jewish experience throughout until 1948 in every country where Jews lived, they were a minority. And that is the overwhelming Jewish experience throughout Jewish history, throughout the diaspora. So you see a contrast there, but both of them being quite sort of proud and emphatic about their identity, which is new. There's a religious contribution, which is my final point, and that is Judaism as a religion is very different from its two daughter religions, Islam and Christianity, both of which purport to be universally valid, and both of which have a mission, which is to reach out to everyone and make converts of everyone who could possibly be converted. The Jewish sort of phenomenon, much older one in that sense, it's more akin to Hinduism in that it's a religion which has grown up within a particular civilization and really claims to relate primarily to people in that civilization. And that is the particularism of Judaism, which makes it narrow and nationalist. On the other hand, that particularism itself gives rise to a more genuine universalism because it's not claiming a religious monopoly. And we have this right back in the earliest pages of the Old Testament. You have the phrase which is often used, someone's a God-fearer. And it occurs many times in the Old Testament, and it's in reference to Egyptians or to Philistines. And the term God-fearer in the Old Testament is being applied exclusively, virtually, to people outside the covenant, non-Israelites, non-Jews, who are righteous people. So when you have a religion which actually doesn't see itself as having universal application, but sees itself as being part of the culture of one tribe, it is, in a sense, more tolerant and more understanding than a religion which claims universal validity, because it can recognize the value of people who don't engage with it at all, but are genuinely good people. And therefore, I've alluded there to two books of the Bible which illustrate that point. The first is the book of Job, and I don't know how familiar people are with this, but this is the book in the Bible which engages with the problem of why righteous people suffer. And it talks about the man called Job, and from a few sentences at the beginning, it's rather obvious that Job has no connection with anything Israelite or Jewish. But it's not terribly important. It doesn't occur for the rest of the book at all, because his nationality and his ethnicity are totally irrelevant. He's there as a sort of human being who suffers, and God makes him suffer, and he's very sort of strong on his position, and he says, why am I suffering? And when people say you're suffering because God is good, and therefore he rewards good people, he punishes evil people, you've been punished, therefore you are evil. And he says, no, that's nonsense. He won't accept that. He says, no, I'm a good man, and he has a big argument with God, which is the whole source of the book. But the important point is that it's not seen, man's suffering is not seen as something in the context of a group or of a religion. And God's justice is seen as something that applies to everybody, and that everyone has a right to call on it. So there's a sort of genuine universalism here, which isn't dependent on the acceptance of any creeds or any cultural things relating to Judaism. And the other example I've given is the book of Jonah, which is the book that we read on the Day of Atonement about Jewish repentance. And again, it has nothing to do with Israel or the Jewish people. And the concept, therefore, of a particular religion is that it can be really much more universal, precisely because it doesn't ask people outside the group to conform to any of the cultural or even any sort of dogmatic ideas of the group. They're valued in their own terms. My last thing is temple rights. That's sort of wanoops. It should be RIT, yes. So I apologize for that. And it illustrates the universalism in that all peoples from all over the world, anybody could come and bring a sacrifice in the temple. Hopefully we're beyond that. But it was that which led to the vision of the temple actually having a universal state in the world. So hopefully the Jewish experience, I feel, is relevant to everyone, because it is the sort of minority par excellence, because everywhere it's been a minority. And that ties in, I feel, with certain elements of the Jewish religion, which, though particular, have, I think, a universal relevance, which is most significant in today's multicultural society. Thank you very much.